I'm Euro,
I'm Chris,
and
and
this
this
is
is
Fork
Fork
Bomb.
Bomb.
March 1st, 2017. In this episode, we're talking about NeXT computers and NeXTSTEP.
For anyone that does not know what NeXT and NeXTSTEP are, NeXT was a company that Steve Jobs created in the late 80s, launched in 1988, and the operating system that ran on it was called NeXTSTEP. And the reason that we're talking about it today, and the reason that I find it personally so fascinating, is while in the past we've talked about obscure operating systems or computing platforms that fell away into obscurity and were eventually forgotten, millions and millions of people still use NeXTSTEP every day and don't realize it. That's because in the mid-90s, Apple bought NeXT, and along with it, their operating system, and along with it, Steve Jobs. And NeXTSTEP became what we now call OS X, or the operating system formerly known as OS X, now once again called Mac OS.
It was interesting learning about this. I knew about NeXT computers. So apparently, and I don't know if this was just he called it that to mean as the next iteration of computing or what, but I just felt like it was his next step in life after Apple. After he was let go. I don't know if he was let go or if he was just put into a very minor position and he didn't like it, so then he left in 1985. Shortly after the Macintosh was launched, he started his own computer company. So I don't know if maybe NeXT allures to that, after Apple kind of thing, but yeah, learning about this made me appreciate NeXT more because I do use a Mac, and I saw a lot of similarities between Mac OS and NeXT. NeXT didn't look as pretty. There was definitely a lot of polishing done between NeXT Rhapsody, which was the interim version between NeXTSTEP and Mac OS X, but yeah, I definitely see a lot of the similarities there. A lot of the things we take for granted in the Mac world and in the generally in the computing world altogether. So, and we, as we're going to discuss, we have a lot to thank NeXT for.
So how do we actually try NeXTSTEP? Because it's not exactly an operating system that you can just throw on any commodity hardware and get the full experience from. Yes, you can install it in VirtualBox, but it doesn't really work very well. It turns out there is an emulator that emulates several models of the NeXT hardware and allows you to run the full NeXTSTEP at full speed like it was intended to be used. And the name of this NeXT emulator is called Previous. Get it?
Yeah.
Previous?
Get it?
Get it? And that was very useful. It allowed us to see how the operating system actually performed and booted at its normal speeds. It allowed us to do things like emulate the Magneto optical drives that came with the NeXT Cube. It allowed us to set SCSI hard disk and SCSI CD-ROMs, and without purchasing actual NeXT hardware, which is prohibitively expensive today. And even if you did get it, the CD-ROM probably wouldn't work, and that by itself would cost anywhere from $500 to $1,000 on eBay. It allowed us to get as close to the full experience as possible.
So I'd like to talk a little bit more about the history and the notable uses of NeXTSTEP, things like that. Things that are still around because of NeXTSTEP. I think those things are good to point out. Maybe our our listeners will get a better appreciation for some of this retro hardware and software. There's a lot of things that were first seen on NeXTSTEP that we see all the time now, but definitely first back then. And not just that, but the hardware too. The hardware in NeXT computers was something. It was state of the art for the '80s. I mean, it was amazing. Of course, it came with an amazing price tag, but actually, Chris, I wanted to know a little bit more about the hardware, and in specific, the Magneto Optical disk system. I saw the video where Steve Jobs is holding up the disc, and he says, "And these are only going to be $50, right?" And I think they held something like 200 megabytes of data, and everybody was awed by this. And of course, 200 megabytes, I know it doesn't mean anything for us today, but 200 megabytes back in 1988, 89, that was a big deal. So I know that Canon was the one that had released the technology, but I heard they were finicky and they could break easily.
I didn't study that much into the Magneto optical drives. By the way, you said an amazing price tag for the NeXT computer. You meant amazing as in crazy, scary, expensive, like north of $13,000. Amazing.
Yes, that kind of amazing. You could buy a car.
Not the deal is amazing. Come on down. Buy 12.
Not that kind. No. It was this was generally made for institutions and higher education. So the government could afford some of those systems. Although they actually kind of failed as a hardware business, and so they had to refocus as a software business.
To back up a little bit, because you brought up the Magneto optical drives, when NeXT first launched, they were trying to decide, should we go with floppies? Should we go with CD-ROMs? Should we go with little Winchester, with small Winchester drives? And they settled on a type of media called a Magneto optical drive, and you won't see them in use today. It's optical media, but optical media that functions like a regular hard drive or like a regular floppy disk. So it's not rewritable in the sense that a CD is rewritable, where you write the entire thing and then you write the entire thing again later. It's rewritable in that it is rewritable like a hard drive, and they look kind of like a floppy disk with a CD-ROM stuck inside of it. It would take too much time to go into how they actually work. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how reliable they were, but they were first seen on the NeXT Cube, and they quickly fell out of favor. If previous is any indication, I don't think that the Magneto optical disc were used in later versions of the hardware, because in previous you can't use the Magneto optical disc option with anything but the cube.
Yeah, I think SCSI hard drives were used later, especially on that what is it, the model that looked like a pizza box. they used to call it the slab. But yes, you're right. So the way they were marketed, Steve Jobs had seen an opportunity in the market for higher education and institutions. So they built this machine around that market. So it wasn't really meant for home consumers. A lot of the stuff that are the notable uses of NeXTSTEP, you can see that why institutions were using it and whatnot, but we'll discuss that a little bit later. They did shift from the hardware business over to just being software, and in the beginning they had amazing hardware. They had like you said, the Magneto optical disk storage drives, SCSI hard drives, and things like that. I think the resolution on the screen resolution was something like north of 1100 by I think 800, and I don't know the exact pixel count, but it was quite high. And this is for the late 80s. So the other, you got to remember, this is the late 80s. People were still running 320 by 240, 640 by 480. Having this really high resolution for the 80s was amazing. So they did shift though from the hardware business. I read somewhere that they only sold about 50,000 units. So that maybe sounds like a lot for a small shop, but not for a shop like NeXT. So they did shift to being a software company, and they actually had ported over parts of NeXT, which was the object-oriented part, over to other systems like Windows NT. So that was something else. Because of that OpenStep API that they developed with NeXT and NeXTSTEP, we actually still use that kind of the basis of that API today in macOS and iOS, watchOS. They're still used by Apple, heavily modified, but the basis is there. So I thought that was also pretty neat. They have some interesting things about NeXT. I'm going to start with one that's pretty interesting, but the other one I think everybody's going to enjoy. And one is that the games like Wolfenstein 3D, Doom, Doom 2, Quake, other games that were made with the id Tech software, they're all made on NeXT hardware. So that's pretty amazing. And everybody played Doom back then, and everybody knew about Doom, but I bet you not everybody knew that it was made on NeXT hardware. So that was one of the platforms that they used. And the other one that's very notable is that apparently Tim Berners-Lee wrote the first web server and web browser. He ran the first web server, sorry about that, and wrote the first web browser on NeXT. So we have NeXT to thank for pretty much the World Wide Web, at least the beginnings of it.
Definitely. And to fill in a little bit of the technical background that I think was glossed over, what made NeXTSTEP very notable was its underpinnings. It is a Unix-based operating system, and they set out with the goal of making Unix usable for mere mortals, and that's Steve Jobs' words in the initial launch of NeXTSTEP. And so a lot of what they built around it, they did with that intention. But what also made it very noteworthy was how developer-friendly it was. They designed an entirely new way of developing that we hadn't seen before, or if we had, at least not to that level. They created their own interface builder where development became as simple as just dragging in objects, scroll bars, text boxes, radio buttons, linking them together, and then writing a bit of code in between in Objective-C to go and fill in the rest of what the interface builder by itself couldn't do. And other developers could write objects that others could use, and the way that they explained their motivation for this was the code that fails the least amount of time is the code that developers never have to write. And this should sound familiar because this is how development on macOS, iOS, watchOS, and tvOS are all done today. It should sound familiar because that is the basis of Xcode, which is what you now use in order to create software for the Mac and Apple's other products.
Yeah, we definitely do have a lot to thank for, actually, for NeXT, for all this technology that was brought up because of NeXT. Using NeXT on the previous emulator, which I know it's not as fun as actually having the real hardware, but hey, it's what we did. I got to see some really neat things, and one of the things that just amazed me was that I can move the panels around and all the contents would redraw as it was moved. And I'd only seen that in Windows NT, and you're thinking, okay, yeah, but Windows NT also came out back then, but this was first. So I could just drag the window around, all the contents would move along with it. You could do it now with Windows. Windows brought it. Windows NT had it, of course. Windows 2000, Windows XP, and forward all do that. But NeXTSTEP definitely did it first, and so
they did it on such modest hardware.
Yes, such modest hardware. I mean, okay, it was pretty beefy for the 1980s, but by the 1990s, it was pretty modest. So absolutely.
I think the next station was like 25. The next station color was like 25 megahertz, 32 megabytes of RAM.
Yes. PCs, or regular PCs, didn't really catch up to that until later. And the CPU cycles, I understand, we did have 25 megahertz CPUs, but just I'm talking about the resolution and things like that. They caught up later. But even then, just 25 megahertz, and you're over here redrawing the window as you move the mouse and you drag that window across. That's amazing on 25 megahertz.
You're redrawing Absolutely. Windows of videos playing.
Yes,
and it's still redrawing it.
Amazing. I saw that when you launch NeXTSTEP, another thing that was very notable, and this is the first thing you see, is you see a dock, and you're thinking, oh, okay, well, great. The Mac OS has a dock. Yes, because of Next. So the dock was born in NeXTSTEP. And one interesting thing about the dock in Next that I can't figure it out on the Mac OS is that the dock is draggable. I can drag the dock up and down and things like that. So I thought that was kind of cool. But yeah, that was another thing that as soon as you run it, you see the dock and you're like, wow, the dock doesn't look anything like our docks, but it is a dock.
And it has a funny way of handling menus as well. So we're all used to either menus sitting at the top of Windows, or if you're on the Mac, menus sitting at the very top of the screen. But they decided, well, these screens are really, really big. We don't want our users to keep having to go to the top of the screen, because we could just have so many pixels. That would be just too much effort. So they made it to where the menus were floating windows with a vertical listing of menus that would then have submenus come out next to them, and you can detach those submenus and move them around. And when you use it today, it seems weird and odd. It's like, why do I have all these menus sitting in the way? But back then, it was definitely very interesting. And when people first saw it, they seemed to be very receptive to it, at least judging by the crowd at the Next launch. But then again, the Steve Jobs reality distortion field was back on in full effect there.
I like the way you put that there. So another interesting thing about the object-oriented apps is that it later became Xcode. So any developer out there that uses Xcode today has NeXTSTEP to thank for that object-oriented portion of macOS. Thought that was pretty neat too. About those menus, Chris, that you had mentioned, some of the things that we have now, is I've seen services. So we have services, and so hide too. You can hide your windows and your panels. I'll call it that, but you can hide your panels and whatnot today, and that was another thing that NeXTSTEP brought around. How about that? The beach ball.
Oh yes, the spinning beach ball of death.
Yep. Well, NeXTSTEP brought that too.
Yep, I was very surprised to see that. Like, I knew I would see some similarities, but it immediately felt familiar the first time I saw that when NeXTSTEP booted up.
Yeah, immediately you see it.
Also, the way that applications are distributed and installed and are structured. For anyone that has dove into the what an application actually looks like on a Mac, you don't see it just from the normal Finder windows, but if you open it up in if you browse around in a terminal, you'll see that every application ends with a .app extension. And those programs, in air quotes, are actually folders with the executables and all of the libraries needed for those programs to run, and they're all self-contained, and you can put them anywhere on the drive, and they just work. Well, that started with NeXTSTEP. All of your applications are .app files. Well, actually not files, folders. Exactly the same. Similarly, you will sometimes have programs that actually need an installer, and you'll see it's a .pkg file, and you double click on it, and it says, okay, I'm going to install it, and next, and then it's installed. That process came from NeXTSTEP as well, and it runs in exactly the same way. The only real difference is that it allows you to pick which architecture you're running on, because Next ran on multiple architectures, whatever the original Next computer ran on, Intel, and a couple of others. And they provided the ability to have applications that could be installed and ran on all of them, assuming they were all built, and it would give you a choice. Which one do you want to install?
You know, those application containers, you can actually also see it in the GUI. You can see the .app file extension if you turn the file extension on, but you can also right-click on any one of those files, any one of those applications, and you can say open to open the containers, open the contents of, and then you can see all the files inside it.
That's on the Mac, right?
On the Mac, yes. Mm-hmm.
On NeXTSTEP, I couldn't find a right click. I didn't see any contextual menus. Maybe I
couldn't either.
I missed it, but yeah, that. But I did figure out how to do menu shortcuts, and that's with the window key.
Okay, the Windows key on your keyboard, or
yes.
Okay, which would, I guess, emulate whatever that key was, something like Command, right?
Yep.
Got it. Well, another really neat thing that I didn't know, but NeXTSTEP uses a lot of the same sound effects that Mac OS later used.
Yes.
So you know when you hit a key on the Mac and what is it, like an error key or something? You know, you're pressing the keyboard and you hear the doom 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 doom. NeXTSTEP had it. And
the exact ones.
Yes, the exact one.
And many of them.
Absolutely, yeah. That was just awesome. That was the most notable one for me because I immediately knew, but there were several other ones that are the exact same sound effects.
The way that you select fonts, the way that you select colors, exactly the same.
Right.
So much of it carried over.
Yep. You could. They used some sort of font panel, which is in use today, and it's just a standard font panel, and you could use it on various applications. You know, we do that today on the Mac. They did it first on Next. Very innovative design, really.
Also, the default mail client that is used in Mac OS, it's the same mail client that came with NeXTSTEP, just polished and iterated on. I don't know if all the same code is still there, but at least some of it is. And that's definitely where it started. It was called mail.app back then. It's called mail.app
Yes.
now, nearly 20 years later.
You know which other one they have is Preview. So Preview was used in NeXTSTEP as well, and they have Preview in Mac OS. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's so many other things. The standard color wheel chooser, let's see, the process task killer. I didn't see that until Windows 95. You know, so many other things, but I thought some really interesting ones was the web application frameworks. So they call that the web objects. You could actually generate dynamic web pages from Next, and they actually did that. That whole dynamic web pages wasn't really a thing back then. I mean, the web was just starting out, and they already had code for dynamic web pages. That just blows my mind. People were still building static web pages at that point.
That is pretty neat, Euro. One thing I would like to point out before we go on to the next section was, geez, it's hard to say next section and so the upcoming section is, I found it very interesting how the original intention was for higher education, and Steve Jobs was even saying we're looking 10 years down the road, and he was showing just graphs of relevancy for varying platforms, MS-DOS, on the IBM PC, in the original Macintosh, and it was always projected for 10 years, it peaks, and then it just dies off. So they were targeting for higher education and 10 years of life. They never really made it in higher education like they wanted to. Their hardware business failed, but their software is still living on 20 years later and counting. No one saw that coming. When they created it, they never expected that. I just find it really interesting and amazing that it worked out like that. I mean, that's, I don't know.
Yeah.
That just yeah.
I call that vision.
Vision can't see that far.
He's like the Nostradamus of computing. I wanted to just briefly go over 3 other things that are really notable of things that are still around because of NeXTSTEP. One of them is the App Store. They had the first electronic software distribution catalog on Next, and that's what we call an App Store today. So they had that. Basic layout options for HTML. They're all part of what they considered back then the NeXTText class. So headers and things like that in HTML, all NeXTText. And the iTunes and Apple website, their corporate site, they still use web objects to power, which came from NeXTSTEP. So I thought those things were just wow, you know.
Some other things foreseen. It's a brief list. Scroll bars that resize based on the amount of window contents.
Yes.
No one has seen that before. It was, I mean, what a novel idea.
Mm-hmm.
We've already covered windows that display their contents when dragging, but those pretty large full color icons that we're so used to today on Mac OS and later on Windows, NeXTSTEP was the first one to do it. Why don't you take the next few?
Well, I mean, there's some interesting ones that like built-in facts to the OS, built-in dictionary, and thesaurus on the OS. Just dragging, dropping large types of content, including pictures.
System-wide drag and drop.
System-wide. That's right. Yeah.
So I mean, like the example they showed was playing a video, dragging a still from the video into mail.app and sending that still image off to someone else.
Mind-blowing for back then.
And system-wide cut, copy, and paste. And we take that for granted. Like, oh, I can just copy in this program and paste in this other program. Apparently, that was a luxury back then.
Right. A clipboard. Mm-hmm.
We had clipboards, but were they system-wide clipboards?
Right.
But still, and you covered it, but still, like, the number one feature first seen still has to be built-in facts. Still there today. What will we do without that?
Oh boy. I don't know. The world wouldn't be the same.
It would be a dark world that I would not want to be a part of.
Yeah. Between that and AOL.
Mm-hmm.
So Chris, I mean, I used the OS, but I think you used it more extensively because you had the opportunity to install various apps and whatnot. How about you? You talk a little bit about just how your experiences with networking and the OS, and just get apps in general.
So I didn't have a chance to play with it too terribly much, but I did dive into the terminal a bit. I did learn how to install applications on it, and most importantly, I wanted to get it on the internet to see what I can do with it. So NeXTSTEP was designed from the beginning to be an internet-enabled OS. It has a TCP stack built in. Most other operating systems at the time did not have that. And it had it built in because it was a flavor of BSD called MachBSD. And so since it probably used a good deal of open source components, it likely was able to borrow the BSD TCP stack. And it already had very familiar utilities right out of the box. Ping, Telnet, FTP, stuff like that. But the challenge was actually getting applications on it. So once I realized that networking was working, I don't know if it was with how previous does networking, or if it's just because of how old the utilities were, but I actually couldn't get anything to FTP over. So I could connect to an FTP server, but whenever I would try to list files or download a file, it would give me an invalid port command. I even tried trivial FTP, that didn't work. So eventually I realized, I can just go and turn a folder into a CD-ROM image, attach that as a SCSI drive, and then I was able to at least get applications onto it. So I tried OmniWeb, a simple, very basic web browser, and was able to browse around on the web. And a very rudimentary web at that. You had to type in http:// in front of everything. You had, if you clicked on a file and expected it to download, like say a zip file or something, nope, it's just going to try to display it, just all the gibberish right there in the web window. And because it's a pretty slow system, it's just going to lock everything up. But it was neat to see how much I was familiar with to still be built in. I already mentioned FTP and TFTP. It has support for the network file system, or NFS, which is used in the Unix and Linux networking world. Should point out that it didn't have a built-in web browser. That's why I had to install one, and that's because while the internet was around, the web wasn't. To be on a Unix system and not have utilities like SSH, SFTP, and SCP, that was jarring at first, but then I realized, they weren't invented yet.
Right.
But what's neat is there are still tons and tons of repositories out there that contain NeXT software that you can go and try and play with. And really, it's very Mac OS-like. The interface looks weird and gray and blocky, and the menus are all funny, but I don't know. It was like you have a good friend. He or she is an older friend, and you know them as they are now. And then you go back in time and you see them when they were much younger and how rough they were around the edges. And you find it interesting, but you would never want to hang out with them at that stage in their life for very long.
Interesting analogy, but okay, yeah. Chris, did you get a chance to play with the world's first web browser?
No, I did not. That is shameful that I didn't. I actually didn't even look for it. I was so obsessed with just getting anything onto it, because I was just at such a dead end with the networking that OmniWeb was the first one that I had landed on.
That's too bad you didn't get to try for the world's first web browser, but it is quite neat, and there's it's on YouTube, so you can look it up, but it's definitely not like the web browsers we have today, that's for sure. Well, so I mean, what do you think? I mean, we did the Amiga episode, and we're doing this next step episode, and next in general. Which one would you say, comparing the two, which one would you say really was ahead of its time more than the other?
More ahead of its time, I would say the Amiga. More revolutionary, NeXT. And well, not NeXT. So easy to get this mixed up. NeXTSTEP. And I say that because we're still using it.
Right. And I agree. I think I have more to thank for. I have NeXT more to thank for. But the Amiga, at the time it came out, the Amiga came out even earlier than NeXT. And yes, it didn't start the internet, the World Wide Web, or anything like that. So But just the technology behind the Amiga was pretty impressive, and compared to anything that was around back then, the Amiga was it was almost like an alien brought it to us. Next was a next step in the right direction, and that's for sure. Yeah, yeah, that's for sure. And we're still seeing the effects of Next today. So yeah, I think I definitely have Next more to thank for. If I had to choose between the Amiga and Next, I would choose Next. As far as something that let's say if you can only choose if one existed, I would choose Next. Absolutely, our world wouldn't be the same. Although I still think back of the Amiga and I'm like, wow. But yeah.
I do think that we may be coming to I don't know, the end of the usable life for NeXTSTEP's legacy. I mean, if I personally haven't used OS X, now called Mac OS, why do they have to keep changing the names, since Snow Leopard? But from what I've heard, it seems like it's just getting more and more problematic, more and more bloated. They're starting to retire older hardware sooner than they used to. I remember when a G3 Mac could be 10 years old and you can still run the latest version of OS X on it. And now we're decommissioning systems from like 2009, 2010.
Yes.
And especially when it comes to phones. I mean, it's amazing that what started as NeXTSTEP has been turned into an extremely viable mobile platform. And while Apple definitely does keep support the longest for its mobile hardware, it's not 10 years. You can't expect to run a phone for 10 years. So we're starting to finally see cracks in the infrastructure. It's going to be interesting to see where they go from here, because in the late 90s, Apple threw everything out in favor of taking OpenStep and turning it into OS X. And in my opinion, I think we are nearing that time again.
That's really interesting, and I think, and I've been thinking this for a while, but I'm thinking that Apple may even drop the x86 architecture and the x64 and do something else, some other crazy thing like embrace ARM, ARM, whatever powers their tablets. They may go that route. I don't know, but just getting rid of the architecture altogether. They may. It's not the first time they've done it. They went from the 68,000 to the PowerPC to the x86, and I think ARM might be next. I don't know.
Yeah, they're certainly no strangers to jumping architectures.
The thing that does bother me, and you're absolutely right, they are dropping hardware support on things that I don't really understand why they would. There are phones out there, the iPhone 5 included, doesn't support I think iOS 7 is the last iOS that it supports. But there's no reason why it shouldn't be able to support iOS 8. And the same thing with the Mac. The Mac Pro is a very capable system running on the same architecture, the x86, x64 architecture, and yet they drop support. So you can't install the latest OS. It just checks, and then it just says, oh, you can't install it. But people have found ways to go around that and disable the check, and they're able to install it, and it's just it's sad. But I guess it's a business. It's the way it is.
But we digress. So that brings us, I believe, if you don't have anything else, to the end of this episode 5 of Fork Bomb about NeXTSTEP. Do you have anything else to add, Euro?
No, I don't. But I would like if people want to write to us, what email can they find us at, Chris?
Currently at forkbombpodcast@gmail.com.
Okay, so forkbombpodcast@gmail.com. If you guys have any questions, we'd love to hear from you. We also have a Facebook page, Fork Bomb Podcast. We have a Twitter page as well, Fork Bomb Podcast as well. So yeah, you can reach us in any of those platforms. And yeah, I'd love to hear your comments and what you guys think.
Yes,
And also
likewise.
any suggestions. If you guys have any suggestions on what you guys what you guys would like for us to talk about,
or even just other obscure systems you would like to have researched, or I don't know, give us something fun. The best part about this process is diving into something we've never played with before and learning all about it and then talking about it.
Absolutely.
Okay, Euro. Well, as usual, it's been fun.
Yep, agreed.
And this brings us to the end of episode 5. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
So, NeXT and NeXTSTEP are a company that create... Shit. Can we start over?
I was looking at people using it, and it's definitely out there. You had menus for to be able to so to go to a certain website, you had to open up a menu and actually type out. Actually, you might have to remove that, Chris. I don't really know where I was going with this. I had it in my head and I couldn't. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, it was weird. The web browser was interesting. Anyway, yeah, you can cut that part out. Blooper.